Have a nice talk, Heather.
Thank you.
Olá, boa tarde para todo mundo. É com prazer, então, que a gente tem hoje a nossa primeira convidada, Heather Turner. Eu vou falar primeiro em português, fazer uma introdução em português, tá? E depois vou fazer em inglês também. E aí vamos deixar ela fazer a palestra. Então, a Heather, ela é engenheira de software no Departamento de Estatística da Universidade de Warwick, no Reino Unido. Ela é usuária do R desde 2001 e foi coautora de vários pacotes no CRAN, principalmente o GNM, o Bradley Terry Tool e o Packet Loose. Heather faz parte do conselho da R Foundation e preside o grupo de trabalho R Forwards, para grupos subrepresentados na comunidade R. Ela também é organizadora do R Ladies Remote. Mais que isso, nessa apresentação formal dela, mas mais do que isso, a Heather é uma pessoa fundamental na comunidade R, que sempre estimula e está presente em diversos eventos sobre o R ao redor do mundo. Inclusive, a Heather foi a principal responsável por existir o R Day hoje em dia, né, como eu comentei lá no começo. Em 2018, ela procurou o professor Paulo Justiniano perguntando se haveria interesse de que o grupo dele organizasse um evento sobre o R no Brasil. E nós aqui do LEG já pensávamos em organizar um evento desse tipo, mas nunca havíamos tirado essa ideia do papel, e a solicitação dela foi que motivou a gente a dar início a esse evento. Então, por isso é uma grande honra receber a Heather hoje. Bom, então eu vou falar em inglês. So, Heather, nice to meet you. Thank you again for giving us this talk. So Heather is a research software engineering fellow in the statistics department at the University of Warwick, UK. She has been an R user since 2001 and has co-authored several C-Run packages, notably statistical modeling packages GNM, Bradley, Terry 2, and Package Loose. Heather is on the board of the R Foundation and chairs the Forwards Task Force for underrepresented groups in the R community. She's also a co-organizer of Our Ladies Remote. But more than that, Heather is a key person in the R community and is always stimulating and supporting groups around the world to build R events. Heather is the main responsible for the existence of the R Day here in Brazil. In 2018, she sought out Professor Paulo Justiniano asking if there would be interest in his group organizing an event about R in Brazil. We always thought of organizing an event, but we had never taken this idea off paper. And the request of Heather was what motivated us to start this event. So it is a great honor to welcome Heather today in our day. So thank you, Heather, and the audience is all yours.
Thanks so much for the great introduction. Okay. So today I'm going to be talking about the development of the R community, and I just wanted to start saying a little about me. I mean, you've already heard a nice introduction there, saying a little bit about my background, but perhaps to just sort of put it in a bit of context with regard to the history of R. So as you heard, I started using R in 2001, and at that time, R was very new, so there weren't many resources for learning R, and in fact, the resources I used for learning R were actually about S+, which is strongly related, but not exactly the same. So one example was this Handbook of Statistical Analyses using S+ by Brian Everett. It was later updated to use R, along with Torsten Hawthorne. But that's how I started, and so I was sort of a bit isolated, perhaps, in my use of R, teaching myself, and talking about it to my supervisors. Just using R as a user, Then when I moved to Warwick as a postdoc in 2004 and started developing my R packages that you've heard about, obviously I became more involved in R, but also the R community, as I started to meet people that weren't just my PhD supervisor who were using R. So I was a postdoc for about 6 years. Then I went and had a time outside academia, but still using R very much, and so continued to be involved in our community activities alongside my freelance work. That was what I was doing for most of the time. And now just this year, as you've heard, I've returned to Warwick as a research software engineer, which gives me the opportunities to sort of combine the software development with the community work that I do. So that's a bit of background, and I'll talk a bit more about the specific things that I've been involved in as I go through the history. But one thing to realise is that as someone that started using R in 2001, I don't have first-hand experience of the history, but I'm going to try and go back right to the beginning of R and start the story from there. So in the beginning, it was a community of two people, Robert Gentleman and Rossi Harker, who you might recognise, as they're obviously very well known within the R community as the people that developed R to begin with. So that was back in 1992. And R is based on S, the S language, and there was the commercial S+ software. And they were interested in developing a software for teaching purposes, for use with their students and for teaching. And so they worked completely independently of the S+ implementation, but it was a very similar language, and they developed the early version of R. And this is a nice photo sort of around the time that Rossi Harker shared in some of the documentation that he's written about the R history of Robert Gentleman and Rossi Harker at a cafe in Auckland, where they were both based at the time. So, they were working on R, again, sort of very much within their own department. And then in 1993, they thought they had something that would be useful for other people. So they shared binary copies of R via the StatLib resource, which is a way of sharing things back in 1993 across the World Wide Web, or I think at that time even it was just by email. And they made an announcement on the S News mailing list. And so that gave, then other people knew about it in other universities in particular. And they started to use R and give feedback to Robert and Ross on how they might improve it or things they might add. And a few particularly academic statisticians started to get involved. One in particular was Martin Mechler, who is still based at ETH in Zurich, as he was then. He was very active, and one thing he particularly was influential on was persuading Robert and Ross to release R under a new public license, the GPL license, so that it was formally free and open source software. So that meant anybody could take it and use it, and look at the source code and so on, and that there was no issues with them using the R software. So we've gone from 2 to 3. And in the early days, it was the three of them, Ross, Robert and Martin, handling bug reports and releases of R by email. And Robert and Ross maintained a small mailing list of interested people to tell them about updates. But that obviously, after a while, became unsustainable. And so Martin took on the job of establishing automated mailing lists. And in 1996, he set up R testers, which I hadn't heard of before, but maybe some of you knew it. And then in 1997, that changed to the 3 mailing lists, R Announce for announcing big news like new releases of R help for asking for help on using R, and R-Devel for discussing and asking for help regarding to the development of R itself. And you might recognize these three as mailing lists that have been going fairly strong ever since, and used widely by the community. And these mailing lists really help to support the community, help people find out about R and use R in their work, and it in turn accelerates the development of R itself, and also R extensions to R that people have built to add to the base distribution that Robert and Ross had developed. And these are what we now call R packages. Initially, like R extensions or packages were distributed by statlib. But again, as it grew and more people started using R, they needed a more formal and robust way to archive R and R packages, and also to distribute them around the world. And so Kurt Hornick from Vienna, who was another person who had got involved in the early days, took on the job of setting up the comprehensive R archive network, which was inspired by the comprehensive tech archive network. And for that reason, it's sometimes known as CRAN, although most people these days would just call it CRAN. So what did it do? It provided a way to distribute the official R source provided by Robert and Ross. The first version of CRAN had 12 packages, including, for example, an early version of the survival package, a package for handling dates, generalized estimating equations, I think GEE stands for. So you might recognize a few of those very early packages there. And initially, it just provided binaries for Debian. That was all, as well as the source and documentation. And there were mirrors of CRAN initially just in the USA and Switzerland, reflecting where the sort of active R developers were based. But R developers in the wider community could then submit a package or an R extension to CRAN. And initially, the process was very simple. They just had to submit it via FTP, file transfer protocol, and send an email to Kurt, and that was about it. So it was quite a simple process to start with. Oh, yeah, I'm sort of jumping on a little bit, skipping outside sort of chronological order for a minute, just to know.
Oi, Paulo, acho que você está mutado. Eu acho que acho que foi um problema na conexão da header. Então vamos esperar um pouquinho.
Since it was started,
continuou. Vamos.
Heather, sorry, we had a brief interruption exactly when you moved to this slide.
Okay.
So if you can restart from this slide, please.
Okay, I'll just restart. Yeah, so I just introduced how CRAN was formed in 1997 by Kurt Hornick, and just wanted to present this graph which looks at the number of packages from that time when it was set up in 1997 up to 20 years later in 2017. This was produced by Julia Silger for an R conference in 2017. Just showing that the number of packages has grown more or less exponentially since CRAN was set up, and so it's been very important in allowing people to contribute and making R more useful, and also growing the developer community. So also about this time, so going back to the history, so CRAN was set up in 1997. R Core was also set up in 1997. So as I mentioned, after Robert and Ross shared the R sources on StatLib, other people started to get involved, and a few of them who were really important in contributing developments were given commit rights to the version control system that was used at the time, CVS. In particular, Luke Tierney from the US, Heiner Schwarzer from Switzerland, and Paul Morell, who was Ross's PhD student. So a sort of informal core team had developed, but in 1997, as Peter Dalgaard said in his tweet on the right-hand side there, they decided to set up a formal R core team, and in that they also added Kurt Hornick again, Peter Dalgaard himself from Denmark, and Thomas Lumley, who's an Australian statistician, but at the time was working in the US. So at the founding of the R core team, we've now got 9 developers, and a widening team of package developers with the help of CRAN. So R continued to be developed this way, and by 1999 they were able to launch the R project website, which initially the R project website and the CRAN website were the same thing. So this is a snapshot, not quite from the launch date, but just a year later, and I don't think too much changed in that time. And looking at the full website on the Wayback Machine, I could see that they'd added CRAN mirrors in Denmark and UK, reflecting where new developers, our core team members, had joined. By this time, there was also already a bug tracker. The original bug tracker was Jitterbug. So people were able to contribute bug reports, which is obviously very important for further development. There was an FAQ document initiated by Kurt Hornick, and also some initial contributor documentation, not just in English, but also in French and Spanish. So starting to see sort of a more international team of users. So that was 1999, our project's website set up. In the same year was the first Directions in Statistical Computing conference. Now, this wasn't an R conference, it was a general statistical computing conference that talked about things other than R, but nevertheless, it was the first time that most of our core team were able to get together and meet each other, having been based in New Zealand, the US and Europe. By this time, a few more people have joined our core. Douglas Bates from the US, Friedrich Gleich from Austria, Brian Ripley from the UK, and Duncan Temple Lang from the US. And John Chambers was also there at this DSE 1999 meeting, who you may recognise as the person that created the S language. And he joined the R core team from 2000. So it was quite a landmark meeting where all of these R developers were able to come together. And then finally, well, not finally, but by the time we get to 2000, the R core team are feeling that R is quite stable, quite well tested and useful. So I think it's a good time to release R 1.0.0, the first production release. And they're quite pleased that they can choose the auspicious date of the 29th of February 2000. So this is when they released R 1.00. And in the picture there, you've got one of the commemorative CD-ROMs that hold a version of R at this time, signed by many members of the R core team, having passed around these discs at different conferences and so on. So that included R version 1.00, and by this time we have about 50 packages, including some names that you probably still recognize, such as the boot package for bootstrapping, the cluster package, foreign for reading in data and writing data for other statistical systems, and NLME for mixed effects models. So it's quite a well-rounded software by this point, and certainly useful for statistical analysis. And so this sort of puts it out there and into the wider world as a software that people should be using for statistical analysis. And of course, people do start using it, and there becomes a need for R core to communicate with this growing community. So they introduced R News, which was a newsletter with 2 to 5 issues a year from 2001 to 2008. And the purpose of the newsletter was to tell people about changes in R, changes on CRAN, to have articles that gave R package introductions to R packages or reviews of R packages. And there were also special columns, programmers niche, and hints for newcomers to give help to newcomers or to focus on a particular programming technique, and also articles looking at applications. In 2003, the R Foundation was founded by the R core team. So the idea of the R Foundation, which was a not-for-profit organisation, was to provide support for the R project by raising funds through donations and memberships, and to provide a reference point for people that in the wider world that wanted to ask the R project something, or to get in contact with the R core team, and also to perform sort of legal duties such as holding the copyright of R. So initially, as I say, in 2003, it was all the members of the R core team at that time, and they've gradually added further members by a majority vote at their annual general meeting, and so currently it's about half and half. The R core team, which is now there's now 18 members on that are both on R core and the R Foundation, and there's 19 other people such as myself who are from the wider R community and have been added because of their contributions to the R project. In 2004, the first Use R conference was put on. So the Directions in Statistical Computing conference that I mentioned before kept happening every couple of years, I think for about a decade. But that was a very technical conference focused on attractive to academic statisticians or computer scientists. And there was a need for a much more practical conference, and so that was the idea of the Use R conference. So at the initial one in 2004, there were about 200 participants, and the program included keynotes from R core and a wide selection of user-contributed talks and posters, which covered all sorts of domains of applications, such as biostatistics, ecology, finance, and so on. Statistical methods and packages that went along with them, and more technical talks and posters on R programming and interfaces to R. So a very broad range, and this is sort of the general spirit of USAR that has continued to this day. It's been held almost every year since 2004, and it's a nice conference that sort of balances between academia and our users in industry, government, and the third sector. When I was looking through these photos, so I should have mentioned about this photo. This is of the poster session at USAR 2004, and I thought it's nice because it shows everybody getting very engaged as the poster presenter is speaking, and they've got their overhead projector in the background, which sort of shows the sort of time period of the conference. And as I was looking through the photos from the conference, which are available through the R Conferences website, the subpage on rproject.org, I saw a slide that showed a map that was titled the USAR World. And I asked about this, and Roger Biband was able to provide the original data, and I redrew the map so we could see a little bit more clearer. So these were the cities that people came from to that first USAR conference. And as expected, you know, it's quite centered around Europe and the US, and you've got those dots from New Zealand. But it's also interesting that there was some representation from elsewhere, including Latin America, Africa, and Asia, even in that early conference. And sort of thinking about the international R world, an important step was made in 2005, particularly driven by Brian Ripley, who ensured that there was support in R for localization, and the support was available in R 2.1, which enabled messages, errors, and warning messages to be converted to another language, as well as the menus and labels in the GUIs. And I was interested to see that one of the initial languages was Brazilian Portuguese, as well as Chinese, English as opposed to American, French, German, Italian, Korean, Russian, and Spanish. So quite a range even from the start. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a screenshot of the Brazilian Portuguese version, but here's the French version of the R GUI as an example. So as I say, Brian Ripley was very important in bringing this about, but of course it also relied on volunteer translation teams. So this again shows how different members of the R community were contributing to R, and this is still a very important way that people can contribute today. In 2005 was the CSDA conference, which has a very long name, the International Association for Statistical Computing Third World Conference on Computational Statistics and Data Analysis. And it's not an R conference, but this is a sort of personal note, because this was my first computational statistics conference that I presented at. And it's where I met Achim Zeileis and Martin Mechler, who are both big people in the R community, and so it was the first time I was sort of exposed to the wider R community and sort of felt welcomed and wanted to get more involved. So it was quite a sort of turning point for me in my R journey. By 2009, the R News had been going on until this time, but the R Foundation realised that something more was needed, and in particular, as more people are contributing to R, particularly through packages and so on, it's important that they got some credit for that, because they're often doing it in their spare time or as sort of as a side project in their academic work, and publishing in a newsletter, even if it's a peer-reviewed article, obviously doesn't have the same prestige as publishing in a journal. So they took the step of converting R News to a journal in 2009, and really the peer-reviewed articles were given more prominence, so they were clearly separated from the news items in the journal. You could download each article as an individual PDF. And in addition to general news, there was also conference reports, because we're now having regular Use R conferences and other conferences in the R community. And from then, we've had a more steady release schedule of 2 issues a year, and that was important in terms of getting the R journal indexed by things like Thomson Reuters, so that it could have an impact factor and all those things that are important for academics in getting credit for their work. On a more informal level, it was the same year that the R community adopted an official hashtag on Twitter. Of course, it wasn't really official, but it just came about as part of the discussions on Twitter. And it was this tweet by Drew Conway from the US, who declared that R stats would be used as the official hashtag, because of course #R wasn't descriptive enough. It didn't really work as a hashtag. And this has been a very important way for a lot of people to connect to the R community, to meet other R users, to get help, to find the news. And of course, it's quite easy for most people, although certainly in the early days that there's an English bias, but for those English speakers at least, an easy way to join and feel a part of the R community. The R Foundation, perhaps a bit late to the party, joined in 2016. But it's been so useful to the R community that there's even a book about it, about how you can use R and really benefit from it as an R programmer. Another important sort of development in the community at this time was R user groups. I don't know when the first R user group was founded, but these here are certainly some, if not the first early ones. There was a panel at the 2020 Use R conference with representatives from these groups, the San Francisco Bay Area group, which was founded in 2008, the Ottawa Gatineau group in Canada. I think they had a meeting in 2008. I'm not sure if they had any earlier meetings. And then 2 other groups that started in 2009, Los Angeles and New York. And not at the panel, but I also happen to know that the London R user group in the UK was founded in 2009. So around this time was when the idea of R user groups really kicked off. And this was particularly important for R users that were not in academia. Of course, it's academic people who go, but this is quite important in getting sort of buy-in from industry and government and so on and support for those who were using R and perhaps not getting the support from their employers or institutions. And some businesses such as Mango Solutions and Revolution Analytics that were R consultancy services really supported the development of these R user groups. And another important development also in 2009, so there's quite a lot happening around this time, was the development of the R bloggers website, which was and still is an aggregator of R blogs. So the idea was that rather than having to search around the web and find blogs about R, it would aggregate them all together, and you can get an RSS feed of new blog posts about R. So this is a snapshot from around that time, just showing a couple of posts that had been released at that time that you could read about, and if you didn't want to use an RSS feed reader, then you could follow via email or Facebook. So it was quite an accessible way of people to find news about R and perhaps a more informal sort of bite-sized write-ups compared to something like the R Journal. Initially, this was just in English, but again, it was quite quickly expanded to other languages. So already in 2010, Indonesian, Italian, Dutch, and Korean, showing the wider R community picking this up. And I think many people have found the R blogs that have been contributed by R community members to be really helpful in in helping them to learn new developments in R, or to learn R itself. Moving on a couple of years now to 2011, this was when R Open Sci was founded, and this is a non-profit organisation founded in the US to foster open and reproducible research through shared data and software. And initially, it was a group of people that got some funding to work on R packages, to develop R packages, to work either with scientific literature or with databases. So it was sort of a big R package development project, but it grew into something much bigger than that, and it's still, of course, around and very, very much present in the R community today. And they provided a lot more services to people developing software for science, such as their package review system, manuals and blogs providing guidance on good software practices, and various community initiatives, particularly the unconferences that ran between 2014 and 2019. And these were events where people from around the world got together and worked together collaboratively on packages, and they really made an effort to reach out to people in different countries, people with different backgrounds, perhaps not the traditional programmer backgrounds, and help them to gain confidence and experience as R developers. So thinking about people with perhaps the non-traditional backgrounds, programmer backgrounds, just spend a moment to think about women in R. So a lot of the names and the faces that we've seen so far have not been women. Women have been at a bit of a minority in the R community historically. And there was a panel, again, at USAR, this time in 2014, to raise awareness of this issue and the sorts of underrepresentation of women in terms of package developers and at things like the USAR conference itself. And this was sort of something that was coming from the wider community. And the R Foundation responded to that over the next year. So myself and Bettina Grun were elected to the R Foundation. Both of us had been past editors of the R Journal and package developers, and have made other sort of contributions. And they set up a task force in that same year that was aimed to help address this issue of the underrepresentation of women. And I was asked to join that, along with Michael Lawrence and Mark Hoare, and a number of other prominent people from the R community. So over the first year, we thought, okay, well, we need to sort of start on something, that where we can have some impact. And so we focused on the USAR conference, and because that was sort of a defined community and something where we could have perhaps some influence. And we did a survey at the USAR 2016. And actually, we were a bit surprised about the results because there we found that actually about a third of the attendees at the conference were women, which was perhaps a bit more than we were expecting, and not too bad compared to the general programmer community. On the other hand, it was really obvious again that the geographical distribution was very skewed towards US, Europe, Oceania, and the sort of race and ethnicity was again very biased. mostly white folk, overrepresentation perhaps of Asian, if we're thinking at least in terms of the US population where most people were coming from, and perhaps underrepresented of people from the LGBTQ community. So perhaps gender inequality wasn't the main issue. And motivated by this, the task force rebranded in 2017 to become Forwards, with a much broader mission, to widen the participation of underrepresented groups in general, so whatever the reason might be for being underrepresented in a minority group. And so since then we've been we're still focused on our foundation activities, so still very much the R Foundation conferences and the journal and CRAN, and we've organised into teams to sort of attack this in different ways. So there's a social media team that helps to run the Twitter accounts and the website that has a blog, a communities team that links to various community initiatives, the conferences team focusing on Use R, On-Ramps, which is focusing on initiatives to help users progress to become R developers, the surveys team running things like the Use R surveys, and a teaching team, which I'll come back to again later. In 2015, the R Consortium was set up, and this is something that people quite often get confused these days with the R Foundation, but it's much newer than that. And the other difference is it's a business association as opposed to a general non-profit organisation. And it also has support from the Linux Foundation behind it. So it's actually a consortium of the R Foundation and businesses. And the original founders, there were 9 businesses, including Microsoft and R Studio. And they've been really important in terms of funding projects to work on our both code and community. Working groups, not necessarily funded, but bringing people together to focus on a topic, and supporting our user groups and conferences. They've been really helpful to sort of direct businesses that want to support R and to sort of funnel that into useful projects. So one example is R Ladies, which I think you had a talk at a previous R Day. So you might know a bit about the history that originally the first group was set up in San Francisco, and then a few groups followed suit around the world. And then in 2016, the San Francisco and London organisers got together at Use R, and were able to meet each other and strategize. And they put in a grant application to the R Consortium to create R Ladies Global. And it's grown quite massively since then. If you want to sort of have a look and see, explore where the R user groups are and the R Ladies groups are, and then there's this nice web app called the R Community Explorer. And I had a bit of a look at that, and I just copied a couple of the plots that you can find there, one for R user groups and one for the R Ladies groups. And just picking out those ones from Latin America, which is the third column here. So you can see we've got more than 100 R user groups in Latin America, and 55 approximately are Ladies groups in Latin America. But it's interesting that relatively, if you look at the columns, that R Ladies has been sort of unusually popular in Latin America compared to the R user groups, and it's really been a way for Latin American R users who identify as women or other gender minorities to really get into R and to put themselves forward on a wider stage as R users and developers, and they've really been strong in that sense. Another R Consortium grant was to set up Saturdays, And the motivation behind this was to set up conferences that were low cost and locally organised. So it's been another good way for people that perhaps can't access things like the USAR conference to have something that's achievable and accessible to them. And that's reflected in where they've happened. So originally, they started off with 2 conferences, one in Budapest, Hungary, and one in Cape Town, South Africa. And since then, there's been around 20 conferences. I'm not sure they've all made it to the Saturday's website, but I think there's been 6 out of those in Africa, and 1 each in South America, Asia, and Oceania. So it's again helped to bring the benefit of our conferences to different regions of the world, and particularly perhaps smaller cities, and give people from our user groups the opportunity to get involved in conference organisation. In 2016, our weekly was first published. It's sort of amusing to me that they had an issue 0, so 0 indexing, even though it's an R initiative. That was published in May 2016, and it sort of builds on what we've had in the past with our news and our bloggers. So it can provide an RSS feed, or you can follow it by email or Facebook and so on, and get news, blogs, our project updates, upcoming events in a weekly digest, or you can follow it on Twitter as well for sort of more regular updates. So this is a broader community initiative that various people have got involved with. Different people curate it each week. So that's been another nice way for both for people to contribute and for people to learn about art. Should I ask how much time I have left to speak?
Heather, we still have 15 minutes.
Okay, I think that's all right. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, so another thing I wanted to mention was Book Down, which perhaps you wouldn't immediately think about it in relation to the art community, but it's been quite important because it enabled people to publish our books and to make them freely available, either on the Book Down website or elsewhere, such as on GitHub. And in this way, the art community has benefited by some really top quality books being available as the authors are writing them, and then if they do publish them, then there's continue to be updated, which is obviously can be an issue with our books or other programming books, that they quickly go out of date. So some well-known ones are the R for Data Science book by Hadley Wickham, the Text Mining with R book by Julius Silger, and David's, I've forgotten his second name at the minute, apologies, and Efficient R Programming by Colin Gillespie, and many other books are there now that the community can benefit from. And this in turn led to the R for Data Science community. So this was founded by Jess Mosterpack, and the idea was that it would bring together learners and mentors who would work through the R for Data Science book and interact with each other on Slack to discuss the book and to help each other understand it and get solve the problems and so on. So that's how it started, but it's sort of grown into a much bigger learning community, and they've gone through other books together, or they just help each other on the Slack. So that's been a really nice thing that sort of spun out from these books being available initially. Yeah, so I mentioned the mailing lists earlier, and for a long time they were sort of the main way that people got help. And in 2017, RStudio introduced the RStudio Community Forum. And because it was founded by RStudio, of course, they were initially focused on RStudio products or RStudio packages, such as the Tidyverse, Shiny, and the RStudio IDE. But it did expand to sort of cover more broader topics, and it provided another way that people could get help on R, with the benefit of the RStudio employees who were able to put some time in, some office hours to respond to people and help. So it's been quite a useful way for people to get help, particularly, you know, if they're maybe a bit daunted by emailing a mailing list where they know very experienced people like Arcor are at the other end. Tidy Tuesday is a sort of the spin out of a spin out, because it's a social data project that came out of the R4 data science community. And if you don't know about this, it's a project where they release data on the Monday, ready for Tuesday. And so from Tuesday onwards, people that want to join in can work on tidying the data and creating a plot. That's their sort of challenge for the week. And then share it on Twitter. So it's sort of a Twitter project. But this has also been taken up by our user groups. We've done it at our local R user group before. It's quite a simple activity that you can do together. You know, it's sort of focused on the Tidyverse, but of course you can use what methods you like. And, you know, if you have the skills, you can do a quick Shiny app or something instead. You know, it just provides a realistic data set for people to work on. I've mentioned Usuários, talked a lot about that, and the Saturdays. And one thing the R Foundation realised is, as we've seen, that Usuários wasn't reaching people around the world, and although there were other local conferences, often these were perhaps more focused on business or you know, much more applied user-focused conferences, maybe not quite so academic. So we wanted to encourage that the conferences that were a little bit more like Usuários, that had perhaps a bit more of a balance between the academic and the applied communities. And so that's how we came to start endorsing conferences. And we were particularly keen to do something in Latin America because you know, there was obviously very skilled R users there, quite mature R community in one sense, but that didn't have these local conferences. And so that's how we started reaching out to different people that we knew in Latin America, and that's how the R Day came about or got started. But also the Latin R Conference, which took place in Argentina the same year, and Connect to Our Conference that took place in Costa Rica the following year. And we're really pleased to see that these conferences have continued either yearly or every other year since. So it's really, we seem to, as I was saying earlier, you know, get in contact with people at the right time, that they were interested in setting up a conference and just needed perhaps a little push to make this happen. And we also endorsed another conference in India in December 2019. So we're really pleased to see that this sort of initiative worked to sort of encourage people to take that step of creating regional conferences. Yeah, I'm going to skip talking about Africa because I'm running out of time, and the Tidyverse Developer Days. I'd like to just briefly mention the minorities in our community because it might not be so well known. This was founded last year by Danielle Smalls-Perkins and Doris Scott after they attended the RStudio conference and really appreciated, you know, being able to meet other people, in their case, other people of colour, and just realising the importance of finding your community and being able to connect. And so they set up the minorities in our community to help other minorities, not just people of colour, but for example, disabled people or other minorities, to get support from each other and to connect with each other, and just provide that additional support to help overcome some of the additional barriers that they face. Okay, I'd like to just mention some things that have been happening quite recently. So one is the development of the R Contribution Working Group, which is a collaboration between our core and community groups, including Forwards. And this working group is focused on encouraging people to get involved in contributing to R itself. So it hasn't been so hard getting people using R, contributing packages, but it's a bit harder to get into R contributing to R itself. And so we've done a few initial steps. We've set up a website, a Slack group, which you're very welcome to join, and a draft version of a guide on how to contribute to R. And at this Usuários, we had two contributor-focused tutorials, one on contributing to R and one on translating R to your language. So that's going back to the translating messages and menus and so on that I discussed earlier. And we're currently in the process of incubating ideas to work on for the next year. And we're having a meeting on September 24th. So if you're interested in finding out more, please do follow the links or contact me afterwards, so that I can help you find where the materials are or send you an invite to the meeting. We've also got package development workshops coming up. These are run by Forwards. So we got some R Consortium funding to run some workshops originally targeted for women, and they were in-person workshops. Now we've taken the material and split it up into 1 hour workshops, which we're running online. And I checked, they are at a sensible time for Brazil. So I think there's still tickets. So if you're interested in that, please do look on Eventbrite and find our Forwards package development workshops and sign up. Right, the main last thing I'd like to briefly talk about is Usuários this year. I've only got a couple of minutes, so I just wanted to show that the opportunity to go virtual really helped us to get much more global involvement in Usuários this year. And even though it was online, people did report back in the survey that they felt they were able to interact with other people during the conference. And we had some great incubated sessions. Sorry, I'm rushing through a bit just because I've put too much in. But we had a number of incubated sessions which were group discussions focused on a topic. And this was another way that we could, that people felt that they could really engage with each other. So it wasn't just a case of listening to video talks all the time. Next year, the plan is to have a hybrid conference. So the in-person bit will be in Nashville in the US, but we're hoping to have a strong virtual component. And this is something we're still working out, how to keep the best of the conference this year, how to make virtual participation engaging. If that's something you'd like to be involved with, let me know, because I think it's sort of almost like organising two conferences, and I think if people are interested and willing to volunteer, be happy to hear from you. There's much more I could have talked about, and I list just a few of the things I thought about as I was preparing this talk that I knew I wouldn't be able to cover. Some I have covered in another talk, which you can find on my website. So if you spot anything here and you think, well, I don't know what that is, or I'd like to find out more, and you can't find it just on an internet search, then you might take a look at my talk. So I think maybe it's been a bit overwhelming. There's a lot of things that the R community have done, both in a sort of top-down way from our core or our foundation, and in a sort of grassroots way from the community. But I think it's all come together to make the R community a welcoming place. I hope you find it so, and I hope you're keen to contribute and get involved. My last slide was just a couple of references that I used to help fill in the history. And I'd particularly like to mention David Smith, who's been blogging for a long time about R, and has really done a great service to the R community of documenting our history. Thanks very much.
Yeah, Heather, thank you so much for your beautiful, historical, and so important talk. It makes a lot of sense when we know where the things comes from. And now we know better where this environment comes from. And if you allow me just a very quick comment, you mentioned Dave Smith, and he's the writer of the very first introduction to our manual with Bill Venables. So a beautiful piece of work on the very early days. Hello, we have a question from our audience. A lot of packages are being developed in GitHub, and there was no GitHub in the beginning. It was all about CRAN, and you mentioned FTP, sending FTP to and Kurt doing the package manager on the other side. So is there any conflict? How these things between GitHub and CRAN would work together?
Well, we still hope that people submit their packages to CRAN, but I think we see GitHub as sort of complementary. It's certainly useful for development and testing of packages. It's also useful perhaps for packages that are sort of utility packages, or perhaps your own customized version of something that's already on CRAN. That perhaps it's more suitable just to share on a sort of personal site. So I think, I think we see it as complementary, and in some ways welcome it, to take a bit of burden off CRAN. That it doesn't mean, it's not that everything has to be on CRAN.
I remember on the very early days, there were no official packages maintained by some very famous statisticians outside of CRAN, and it worked beautifully. So, Heather, I'd like to thank you so much for the talk. I will hand over to Fernando. So it was great having you with us here today.
Heather, thank you very much again. It was a beautiful explanation of the history of art. It's always very good to know what the people behind what we use every day. So it was very great to hear from you, and the audience here in the YouTube chat it's thanking you very much. Many people thanking you. So we thank Heather. We have another activities right now, so we come back soon with another presentations from José Cláudio Faria. So good afternoon to everyone, and thank you again, Heather.
Thank you.